Keanu Reeves stepped into the Grand Salon, his presence both quiet and commanding. He carried himself with an ease that belied the stark contrast between his rugged appearance and the pristine elegance that surrounded him. His long, tangled hair fell past his shoulders, his thick beard rough and unkempt, evidence of months spent embodying a role that had demanded everything from him. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Salon was a sanctuary of luxury, where time seemed to slow, and every detail, from the gold-trimmed mirrors to the crystal chandeliers, was meticulously curated to exude perfection. The scent of imported colognes and lavender-infused oils lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. Conversations flowed in hushed, refined tones, voices dipped in exclusivity. Yet, as Keanu crossed the threshold, the energy in the room shifted. A ripple of whispers swept through the salon like a silent wave, subtle yet unmistakable. Eyes turned, discreet glances cast in his direction before darting away. Some lingered longer, their scrutiny filled with unspoken judgment. To the well-manicured patrons reclining in velvet chairs, their designer attire pressed to perfection. He was an anomaly, an outsider, a misplaced figure in a world of curated beauty and seamless elegance. His faded jeans and worn black t-shirt stood in stark opposition to the polished suits and couture dresses that filled the room. The scuffed leather boots on his feet had walked miles beyond the marbled floors beneath him. A woman near the reception desk, her platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves, lowered her champagne flute and leaned in toward her companion. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet the condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Did he take a wrong turn? Her friend, a man dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, smirked before taking a slow sip of his drink. Or maybe he just wants to say he's been here. Let's see how fast he leaves when he hears the prices. The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge unspoken among the privileged few who had never questioned whether they belonged. They expected hesitation, a faltering step back, perhaps even an awkward glance at the polished menu of services before retreating out the door. But Keanu? He remained unshaken. His expression was unreadable, his movements unhurried as he made his way toward the reception desk. His eyes, deep and knowing, held no sign of discomfort. If he heard the whispers, he gave no indication. If he felt the weight of judgment pressing against him, he carried it with the same quiet grace he had always carried everything else. This was not the first time he had walked into a room where people assumed they knew his worth before he had spoken a word. And it would not be the last. What they did not realize, not yet, was that the man they had been so quick to dismiss was about to leave a mark far greater than they could have ever imagined. Keanu Reeves stepped into the opulent salon, the kind of place where perfection wasn't just expected, it was required. The air inside was thick with the scent of designer perfumes and freshly brewed espresso, a carefully curated blend meant to exude refinement. The walls gleamed with polished marble. The lighting was soft yet deliberate, casting a glow that made every surface seem even more pristine. He moved through this world of luxury with an effortless composure, his presence commanding yet understated. He was no stranger to places like this, spaces where people sized each other up with a single glance, where silent judgments were passed before a word was ever spoken. Years in Hollywood had taught him that wealth and status often dictated the way someone was treated. But Keanu had never played by those rules. As he approached the reception desk, he was met by a woman who, much like the salon itself, was meticulously polished. Every strand of her hair was perfectly in place, her makeup flawless, her suit tailored to fit as if it had been made for her alone. She greeted him with a professional smile, but something flickered behind her eyes, a barely perceptible hesitation. For the briefest moment, she took in his appearance, the slightly unkempt beard, the long, tousled hair, the well-worn boots that had undoubtedly walked through places far rougher than the pristine marble beneath him. There was no outright rudeness in her expression, but there was something else, calculation, a silent weighing of whether or not he belonged. Keanu's voice, when he spoke, was steady, calm. "I'd like a haircut and a beard trim." Her smile remained, perfectly practiced. But the pause that followed was just a second too long. A hesitation that was barely noticeable, yet heavy enough to be felt. Around them, other patrons subtly tuned into the exchange. Their interest peaked. The quiet murmur of conversation softened as curious glances were exchanged. They had seen this before. A man who had wandered into the wrong place. Someone who, any moment now, would realize his mistake, the kind of mistake that came with a price tag he hadn't anticipated. The receptionist finally spoke, her tone smooth and even, carefully measured. "Of course," she said. Then, with the faintest tilt of her head, she added, "Just so you're aware, our services start in the 4-digit range." There it was, the unspoken challenge. The air in the room shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. Conversations dipped into hushed whispers, the space around them growing heavier with anticipation. The salon's elite clientele, lounging in their designer ensembles, now found themselves waiting for a familiar reaction, hesitation, discomfort, maybe even an awkward chuckle followed by an embarrassed retreat. This was the moment where he was supposed to falter. But Keanu? He didn't. He didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze with an ease so natural, so completely unaffected, that it caught her off guard. His expression remained unreadable, steady, and then, with quiet certainty, he responded, "That won't be a problem." A shift, small at first, but undeniable. The carefully composed professionalism on the receptionist's face wavered for just a second before she regained control. But the room? It had not yet adjusted. The patrons who had expected a different outcome found themselves caught in something unexpected, a moment of doubt. They had assumed they knew the script, the predictable arc of this interaction, but the man before them had already broken it. Because in just a few words, Keanu Reeves had done what no one expected. He had rewritten their assumptions, and he was far from finished. The murmur of quiet conversations and the soft hum of blow dryers came to an abrupt halt as the salon doors swung open. The air inside, once filled with quiet amusement and whispered ridicule, grew thick with a new kind of tension. A tall man, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, stepped inside. His sharp gaze swept across the space, missing nothing: the sudden stiffness of the employees, the uneasy silence that settled over the clients, the way the stylists instinctively straightened as if sensing the shift in hierarchy. This was no ordinary man. This was the manager. His presence alone carried an air of authority. But today, there was something else in the way he moved, something alert, calculating. He could feel it in the air, that undeniable charge, a disruption in the careful exclusivity of the space he so meticulously curated. And then, his gaze landed on the man seated in one of the styling chairs. He stopped abruptly. For a moment, his usually composed expression flickered with uncertainty, his brain working faster than his mouth could form words. He knew that face. "No, it couldn't be. It can't be," he murmured under his breath. But even as he said it, the truth settled in his chest like a stone. A sharp breath, a quick adjustment of his tie, and then, without another second of hesitation, he strode forward, his footsteps crisp against the marble floors. As he reached the chair, his demeanor shifted entirely. The confusion melted away, replaced by something else, something akin to reverence. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, slicing through the thick wall of judgment that had been built around the man seated before him. "It's an honor to have you here." Gasps rippled through the salon like an unexpected gust of wind. The shift was immediate, palpable. The once arrogant stylists, who had laughed under their breath and exchanged knowing glances just moments ago, now stood rigid, their faces draining of color. Clients who had smirked, who had whispered assumptions about whether Keanu could even afford to be there, suddenly avoided eye contact, their once smug expressions now tight with unease. And then, there was Marcus, the stylist who had, without hesitation, deemed himself superior, the one who had sneered, made sarcastic remarks, and openly questioned whether Keanu could pay for their high-end services. He stood behind the chair, his confidence crumbling in real time, his hands gripping his shears just a little too tightly. A bead of sweat gathered at his temple. It was one thing to mock a man he assumed was beneath him. It was something entirely different to realize he had been mocking someone far beyond his comprehension. The weight of his mistake pressed against his chest. The manager, still composed but visibly displeased, turned to Marcus and the other staff members. His voice, though measured, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of disappointment. "I trust," he said slowly, "that Mr. Reeves has been treated with the level of professionalism we expect here?" Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The words he wanted to say, the excuses, the justifications, they dissolved before they could even form. What could he say? That he had laughed? That he had judged? That he had assumed Keanu was just another nobody wandering into a place he didn't belong? No explanation would erase what had happened. No justification could rewind the way he had belittled a man who had given no reason to be treated with anything less than respect. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. The other stylists, who had snickered alongside Marcus, shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flickering between the manager and Keanu. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Keanu, still seated, still composed, finally broke the silence. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. Instead, he simply met the manager's gaze with quiet strength and said, "Now," his voice even, steady, yet undeniably powerful, "let's talk about how we treat people." The words weren't spoken with anger, nor with self-righteousness. There was no need for theatrics, no demand for retribution. But somehow, they carried more weight than any outburst ever could. Because what had happened here today, what the staff, the clients, and even the manager had witnessed, wasn't just about one man's mistreatment. It was about something bigger. It was about the way they had all played a part in it. It was about how easy it was to look down on someone who didn't fit the mold of luxury. How effortlessly they had dismissed a man based on nothing more than an assumption. And now, in the silence that followed Keanu's words, every single one of them had to sit with the reality of who they had been in that moment. No one spoke. No one moved. Because there was nothing left to say. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an unspoken reckoning. The grandeur of the salon, the golden-framed mirrors, the opulent chandeliers, the delicate scent of imported candles, suddenly felt insignificant in contrast to the raw truth that had just been laid bare. The same staff who had chuckled under their breath, who had exchanged smug glances and whispered comments, now stood motionless. Their earlier arrogance had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, lingering shame that was impossible to ignore. Keanu remained composed, standing in the center of the room, his presence radiating an unshakable calm. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand respect. The sheer gravity of his words was enough. He swept his gaze across the room, meeting the eyes of each person in turn, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something deeper, understanding. People shouldn't be judged by their appearance, their clothing, or their wealth, he said, his voice steady, carrying through the silent salon. It's easy to show kindness to those you think can benefit you, but the true measure of character is how you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer you in return. A murmur of realization rippled through the room, quiet but undeniable. At one of the styling stations, an older woman, who had earlier whispered cruel remarks about Keanu's presence, dropped her gaze to her lap. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's right." Her companion, a man who had chuckled at Marcus's earlier jabs, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat but said nothing. Across the room, a young stylist, who had only observed but never spoken up, swallowed hard. Her face, once lit with amusement as she watched Marcus's taunts, was now lined with regret. She had laughed along, not because she truly believed Keanu deserved mockery, but because she had wanted to fit in. And now, in the quiet, she realized how much that choice had cost her. The manager, standing stiffly near the entrance, exhaled slowly. His gaze was unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. The reality of the moment was unavoidable. This wasn't just about one man's mistreatment. It was about a culture, an attitude that had gone unchallenged for too long. The salon stood in heavy silence, the weight of the moment settling into the marble floors, the gold-trimmed mirrors, and the very air itself. The chandeliers still cast their soft glow over the room, but their light now seemed colder, as if the space had been stripped of its usual pretense. The manager, a man known for his polished professionalism and keen sense of business, had always prided himself on running a salon that catered to the elite. But now, as he looked around at his staff, the stylists who had laughed, the clients who had whispered, he realized how much he had overlooked, how easily they had fallen into the habit of silent judgments. His jaw tightened slightly as he nodded, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. "This will not be forgotten," he said, his tone firm but sincere. He turned, addressing the room as much as himself, "And it won't just be words. We will change." He didn't say how. He didn't outline a plan. But the way his voice carried through the space left no doubt. This moment would not be brushed aside. It would not become just another fleeting incident, drowned out by the next wave of gossip or exclusivity. And then, something unexpected happened. For the first time since entering the salon, Keanu's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried more meaning than any grand speech ever could. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It wasn't a smile of satisfaction. It was a smile of quiet understanding. He had seen this before. He had lived long enough, experienced enough of the world, to know that true change did not come from a single moment. It came from the choices made afterward, in the quiet, in the everyday. "I hope so," he replied, his voice gentle, yet resolute. And then, just as effortlessly as he had entered, he turned to leave. He didn't linger, didn't wait for applause or gratitude. He didn't need to. With each step toward the door, the weight of what had transpired pressed further into the minds of those left behind. Marcus, the stylist who had ridiculed him the most, remained frozen near his station, his hands clenched at his sides. The smirk he had worn earlier was long gone. His mind replayed every mocking word he had spoken, now hearing them in an entirely different light. The receptionist, who had subtly hesitated when greeting Keanu, stood rigid behind her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prided herself on professionalism, on maintaining the exclusivity of the salon, but for the first time, she wondered if she had mistaken exclusivity for arrogance. Even the clients, those who had quietly indulged in the spectacle, sat with discomfort. Some glanced toward the exit. Others simply looked at their reflections in the ornate mirrors, as if seeing themselves for the first time. Keanu reached the salon's entrance, and without a word, pushed open the heavy glass doors. The hush that followed was almost eerie, as if the very walls of the salon held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The doors swung shut behind him with a soft click, and just like that, he was gone. But the lesson he had left behind lingered. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of his presence still pressed down on the space, as if time itself had slowed to allow them to process what had just unfolded. It wasn't about who he was, not about his fame, not about his wealth. It was about the principle he had carried into the room with him. The reality was painfully clear. This wasn't just about a single moment of judgment. It was about every choice that would follow. It was about whether the people in that salon would return to their comfortable habits, or whether they would let this moment change them, truly change them. The manager exhaled slowly, then turned back to his staff. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear. From this day forward, things will be different. No one dared argue. And outside, as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the bustling streets, he did not look back. He didn't have to, because true change, if it was real, did not require an audience. Keanu stepped out of the salon and into the city's familiar hum, his pace unhurried, his presence unchanged. The sharp contrast between the world inside the salon, where wealth dictated worth, and the streets of reality was stark. Yet it did not faze him. He had never been the kind of man to let status define him. nor had he ever sought validation from those who measured value in material things. The city pulsed around him, alive with movement and sound. The distant wail of a siren faded into the rhythm of footsteps against the pavement. Street vendors called out their offerings, their voices blending with the occasional honk of impatient drivers. People hurried past, wrapped in their own concerns, their gazes fixed ahead. But as Keanu walked, something caught his attention, a small shift in the world that others might have ignored. A man sat on the curb, his posture weary, his presence nearly invisible to those who walked past without a second glance. His clothes were layered but thin, a clear defense against the lingering chill in the air. Beside him, a battered cardboard sign rested against his knees, the edges curling from use. The words, written in uneven strokes, were simple but heavy. Hungry. Any help would be appreciated. Keanu paused. He had spent the last hour in a place where people judged worth by appearance, where status was measured in dollar signs and designer labels. And yet, here, on the same street, sat a man who, by those same shallow metrics, was deemed invisible. Without hesitation, Keanu stepped forward, lowering himself to the man's level. He didn't just drop money into an outstretched hand and move on. No, he crouched down, meeting the man's eyes, acknowledging him as more than just a fixture on the sidewalk. There was no pity in Keanu's gaze, only quiet understanding. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a generous sum, enough not just for a meal, but for warmth, for shelter, for a brief moment of peace in a life that had likely known little of it. He placed the bills into the man's hands, the gesture simple but profound. For a moment, the man only stared at the money, as if his mind needed time to register what had just happened. Then, his fingers curled around it, his grip tightening as his throat bobbed with a silent swallow. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with disbelief and something even deeper, gratitude. "Thank you." Keanu gave him a small nod, a faint but genuine smile crossing his lips. He didn't linger, didn't wait for more words. He simply stood, offering one last glance of quiet reassurance before stepping back into the steady rhythm of the city. But behind him, something had shifted. Back inside the salon, the atmosphere had not yet recovered from the weight of what had transpired. The echoes of judgment, the laughter that had once carried such confidence, now felt misplaced, misguided. The patrons, once so sure of their assumptions, found themselves unsettled by the stark contrast between who they had expected Keanu to be and who he truly was. Marcus, the once smug stylist, had retreated into silence, his usual bravado stripped away. He had spent years perfecting an image of authority, of control, of superiority over those who sat in his chair. But now, all he could feel was the burn of his own misjudgment. The manager stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the afternoon settle over him. He had spent years overseeing this establishment, curating an image of prestige, of exclusivity. This salon wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where money spoke louder than words and where status was as tangible as the marble floors beneath their feet. And yet, something about today had unraveled that illusion. He slowly scanned the room, his sharp eyes moving from one face to another. The receptionist, still standing stiffly behind the desk, was clearly replaying the last hour in her mind. Her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and contemplation. The stylists, who had once chuckled at Marcus's dismissiveness, now busied themselves with meaningless tasks, adjusting their tools, straightening products that were already perfectly aligned. Even the clients, who had so easily indulged in judgment, now avoided one another's gazes, their once confident postures slightly diminished. A silence lingered in the space, heavier than before, not the silence of arrogance, nor of indulgence, but of realization. Keanu Reeves had left the building, and yet, his presence still filled it. The manager inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening slightly as he exhaled. He wasn't a fool. He knew what had just happened. He had watched it unfold right in front of him. He had seen Marcus, a stylist who had always carried himself with an air of superiority, unravel in real time. He had seen the moment the room collectively understood that they had all made a mistake, and now it was his responsibility to correct it. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the entrance. The golden handles of the grand glass doors gleamed under the salon's soft lighting as he pushed them open. Stepping outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm glow over the city streets, where life carried on as usual, horns honking, conversations overlapping, the scent of roasted coffee beans drifting from a nearby cafe. But the salon's exterior, pristine and elegant, bore the same weight as the people inside. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of the exclusivity they had spent years cultivating. And now, it was time for a change. With a quiet nod to himself, the manager gestured toward a nearby staff member, instructing them with a simple request. Moments later, a new sign was placed just outside the entrance, affixed beneath the golden fixtures and the polished image they had worked so tirelessly to uphold. The letters, bold and gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, carried a message that was both a lesson and a promise. Here, everyone is treated like a celebrity. It was more than a policy change. It was an acknowledgement, a reckoning, a realization that respect should never be a privilege reserved for a select few, but a right extended to all. That kindness should not be conditional. That dignity should not be measured by wealth, nor by the labels on one's clothing. And that real excellence wasn't in the marble floors, or the gold accents, or the exclusivity they had prided themselves on. It was in how people were treated. Inside, the salon had already begun to feel different. A shift that had started as discomfort was now evolving into something deeper, reflection. Some of the clients, once so absorbed in their own status, sat quietly, their gazes fixed downward. Lost in thought, Marcus stood near his station, his posture no longer rigid with pride but slightly slumped, his arms crossed over his chest, his mind clearly wrestling with something unspoken. The receptionist, who had once hesitated before answering Keanu, now looked visibly unsettled, as if replaying every moment of their interaction, wondering how she could have handled it differently. Keanu had not demanded an apology. He had not needed to, because the lesson had already been learned. Keanu never looked back. He didn't need to. As he walked down the bustling street, he blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the city, his steps unhurried, his presence as unassuming as ever. He had no interest in the opinions of those he had left behind. He didn't need validation, nor had he sought redemption. What had transpired inside that salon was not about him. It was about them. It was about the way people treat others when they believe there is nothing to gain. About the ease with which society decides who is worthy of kindness and who is not. About the illusions of wealth and status, and how quickly those illusions can be shattered. And in that moment, Keanu had left them with something far greater than money, far more lasting than prestige. He had left behind a reminder that true worth is not found in designer suits or luxury services. It is not determined by a price tag, nor is it reflected in the approval of others. It is found in character, in integrity, in the way a person carries themselves, not when the world is watching, but when it isn't. And in the end, that was the only legacy that ever truly mattered. The manager lingered outside the salon for a moment, watching the city move around him. The weight of what had just transpired sat heavily on his shoulders, but beneath it was something unexpected, relief, a chance to set things right, to reshape not just the salon's image, but its very essence. He had spent years believing that exclusivity was what made them special, that catering only to the elite ensured prestige. But now, standing beneath the newly placed sign, he realized how wrong he had been. Inside, the shift was palpable. The once buzzing atmosphere had quieted into something introspective. Stylists glanced at each other, as if silently acknowledging the moment that had just unfolded. Marcus, still standing near his station, seemed caught between shame and revelation. He had built his career on the belief that status defined worth, that appearance dictated respect. But in the presence of someone who embodied humility and quiet confidence, his carefully crafted arrogance had crumbled. The receptionist swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting by the desk. She replayed her hesitant response to Keanu, The way she had stalled before acknowledging his appointment. Had she really been so blinded by assumption? She wanted to say something, to express the regret that was gnawing at her, but she wasn't sure where to begin. Then, a familiar figure stepped forward, an older woman, a longtime client known for her sharp wit and discerning taste, rose from her seat. Unlike many others in the room, she had not looked away during the interaction. She had watched, absorbing every moment, every shift in energy. Now, she approached the receptionist, placing a gentle hand on the young woman's arm. "Respect isn't something you ration out, dear," she said softly. "It should be given freely, to everyone who walks through these doors." The receptionist's eyes widened, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. She only nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep.